Welcome in to the Fantasy Football Forge. My name is Steve, and it is time for the Week 2 injury report from over the weekend, not including the Monday night games for any of this, as well as, of course, the waiver wire options. It's not a great week for the waiver wire. With that said, if you're not familiar, my waiver wire is not going to be strictly, rated 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, a little bit more nuanced than that, so I'll walk through it, but this is all available up on the website at www.theffforge.com. You can see there's a link down in the description, as well as that's just right below me there. Let's begin with the Week 2 injuries list, and last week, Greg Dulcich was put on the IR due to his hamstring injury, so another 3 weeks without him since they got that in last week. Then Boston Scott suffered a concussion in the Thursday night game. That is, on average, a 9-day injury. So there is a chance that he could return, given that that was a Thursday night game, for next weekend. Don't know what that matters. Devontae Adams is quote-unquote good after suffering a potential concussion towards the end of the game. I don't know that that means that he did not suffer a concussion, though, just that he's doing well. So I'm still not positive on that one. Then David Montgomery suffered a quad bruise. He has said that he is expecting it to be a 2-week injury. It could be less than that. It could be more than that. So that's where I'm giving it a 1 to 3 week injury estimated time for recovery for his injury. However, expect 2 weeks for now. Then Darnell Mooney had a knee injury. It is said that it is not serious, is what we know about it so far. Same with the Odell Beckham injury. They have come out and said his ankle injury was minor, and they are optimistic about him being able to play this coming weekend, so we will see about that. Anthony Richardson had a concussion, so once again, don't expect him to be coming back next week. Joe Burrow had re-injured his calf injury, it would appear. So I have no clue what the recovery time is. Is he going to be back next weekend? The coaching staff or somebody said that he would have gone into the game if they got the ball back. That is not a direct quote. That's what they said, though. You think about a week ago, Aaron Jones also would have gone into that game if they had needed him in that game down the stretch, but they didn't need him. Of course, the endorphins, the adrenaline, it runs out after a game. And I think a lot of us, we've had injuries in the middle of athletics when we were younger or something, and oftentimes it gets worse after the fact. So wait and see on Joe Burrow. That's going to be a potentially big storyline this week. Then Logan Thomas also had a concussion on a cheap hit, so do not expect him to be able to come back next week. Saquon Barkley, they have a Thursday night game, so do not expect him. It's an ankle sprain. The results of an MRI have not come through yet. There was no structural damage to the bones. X-ray came back negative, but the team has said that he avoided something very serious. So, the difference between very serious and still missing a few weeks is there. So who knows exactly what the time frame will be, but this week, they're going up against San Francisco, and even if he's active, to the best of my ability, if possible, I just wouldn't be messing with him this week and plan on not having him regardless. That way you can plan maybe a little bit better, too, with the waiver wire options. Brandon Ayuk had a shoulder injury. He remained in the game, but it is of note that he was in and out. He was not, they were starting drives without him on the field, where he normally would have been on the field throughout the game, so he had a limited amount of work this weekend. That did not help. Even with that, he almost had a good weekend, and that was not going to come at a detriment, as far as I can recall, on a couple of missed plays to Brandon Ayuk, an overthrown touchdown pass, etc., that it's not like Deebo Samuel had success on the rest of the drive. So that's nice. Both Deebo and Brandon Ayuk could have eaten this week, and same with Christian McCaffrey ultimately, but just didn't come through like that. It's a little bit concerning for 1 week here or something like that for that shoulder injury. Hopefully it's nothing that lingers throughout the season. We're going to have to wait and see if it's anything more severe that maybe they didn't realize during the game, though. I haven't heard anything about that. Salvin Ahmed had a groin injury that is a 0 to 6 weeks, depending on how serious it is. Obviously, we're probably not planning on starting Salvin Ahmed, but it could make for a chance for a guy like Devon A-Chain or something like that in the coming weeks. That's about it. Then Chase Edmonds had an MCL sprain that's going to take him out 4 to 6 weeks. He's expected to be going on the short-term IR. And Jalen Waddle had a concussion. Once again, the expectation would be that he will not be playing next week, but it's always possible. And it's possible that he could be out for longer. Concussions, these are averages that we're looking at for the most part once I know the specific injury, or we don't know the specific injury, kind of more of a range. Let's move on to the waiver wire, starting off with the quarterback position. And starting with the must rosters, it looks like Jared Goff got dropped a lot after week 1. This is a good offense, and it's a defense that doesn't appear to be there yet. So this offense will have to continue to pass plenty, it would appear. Just lost their starting running back as well with David Montgomery for the short term. That said, I don't necessarily love the upcoming schedule. Atlanta, Green Bay, Carolina doesn't seem like super high upside schedules, but at the same time, nothing that can keep him from having solid weeks. And you see the strength of schedule over the course of the season is what these are. It looks fine, too, for Jared Goff yet. Then Jordan Love is still in my must-roster list here, and he's just barely there. But he has had 6 passing touchdowns over the first 2 weeks of the season, so that is good. I don't know that he looks as good as someone who has had 3 passing touchdowns in each of the games. But the main reason that I still have him up here is coming up in 2 weeks and in 3 weeks, there's a couple of matchups there that I really, I'm willing to hold on to Jordan Love on the backside of my roster and then potentially, depending on my starting quarterback, start him in those matchups. Then in my could roster grouping, we have Derek Carr heading this group. It could become a must roster depending on what tonight looks like. But it's a good strength of schedule for the remainder of the season for him. Then Matt Stafford's also going to make this list, a little bit of a tougher schedule for the entirety of the season. Do like some of the upside of a couple of really all of the upcoming matchups to some extent. He's just a guy that would never hurt to have as a QB2. Sam Howell, a couple of upside matchups between Buffalo and Philadelphia that could be horrible games, could be great games. And then Chicago to follow that up. So some solid, upside for Sam Howell. Hopefully you don't have to rely on him, and strength of season schedule is not that great, but he is somebody that you could roster yet. Iffy. Then Kyler Murray is on the IR currently. You could put him in an IR spot if you wanted to. That's all. Just going to remind you about him. If you find yourself making a move midweek, you can always pick him up, put him in your IR spot, and then pick up whoever you actually wanted to pick up if you have an available spot there. My stream and C's, just guys we have even less confidence in here, but have put something out there into the world that could be exciting. And for Baker Mayfield, he's had 2 really, really good matchups to start the season. Philadelphia has been shaping up so far to be a good quarterback matchup as well. It's tough to say that I would trust Baker Mayfield, but you could do worse than him on the backside of your roster. And then Desmond Ridder, a couple of really a nice setup here for the next 3 weeks, good season-long schedule. And what I do like about Desmond Ridder is, first of all, because of that running game, that should make the passing game easier at least. And we kind of saw that up against Green Bay, which is a pretty good secondary for the most part. At least they should be. They have the talent to be. In addition to that, you also saw him take off for 10 rushing attempts. It's not like he doesn't have the athleticism of a Lamar Jackson or anything like that, but he is a younger guy who can take off, get you some of that base floor week in and week out rushing yards, which are valuable, 2.5 times more valuable than passing yards for most leagues. And I just find him to be I think he'll be one of those guys where you can bank on like 17 plus fantasy points, but you're not expecting more than like 22. Just a real steady Eddie with a floor that can be terrible, will be terrible some weeks throughout the season, but also, for the most part, will be consistently okay, at least depending on the matchup. that's how I see those guys. Once the title stream and see for this group doesn't necessarily mean you're streaming and starting them. It's more like put them on your roster just to see what they look like for one more week and see if you want to hold on to them. And if you don't want to, you're not going to feel guilty about dropping them. That's going to bring us on to our running backs. And right off the top, there's really nobody I'm breaking the bank for this week. We'll see 3 names here. One coming off a huge week with Zach Moss. I would still prefer these guys barely, but Zach Moss does have the upside of what's going on with Jonathan Taylor, so he does have that season-long upside. It's not supposed to be a great schedule season-long, but yeah, I'm not going to argue if you say he's the top roster guy. I just don't think you should be breaking your bank for him. I still have some faith in, and obviously uncertainty with the whole Kenneth Gainwell thing. This is kind of maybe similar to Zach Moss, where it's a bit of an upside hope play here of, Kenneth Gainwell just returns to his role that he had in week 1, or is at least semi-reliable, depending on the matchup, something like that. And then you have Justice Hill, Gus Edwards, which is a still kind of complex, confusing group. I have Gus Edwards on my roster. I feel like I could drop him at any point, but at the same time, I kind of want to hold on to him and see a little bit more, if possible. But it seems like Justice Hill still had all the more valuable stuff, and Gus Edwards is still, like, he, inside of I think it's the 10-yard line, maybe inside the 5, Justice Hill had like 7 of 8 carries. Gus Edwards had 1 of them. He got a touchdown on his 1 of them. Does that make the team now want to use Gus Edwards since he was much more, successful in that area of the field over Justice Hill, which would make sense that he would be more successful in that area of the field, despite them have having faith in Justice Hill for the first couple of weeks in that kind of situation. I don't know. It's still a big question mark there. You don't love either of them. You don't hate them. Zach Moss, if you picked him up and used him last weekend, you love him. I'm still concerned about it, but he does go potentially into that grouping of the Damian Pierces, maybe the Alexander Madisons, but also like a little bit, well, he might be as talented as Alexander Madison, but I feel like he's kind of in that group, best case scenario, and I don't even know about that. Whereas at least these guys are on better offenses. That's what I like about them. Then Craig Reynolds is going to see an opportunity for a couple of weeks. But okay, so for the first part here, looking at Zach Moss's schedule for the next 3 weeks, I really don't like it a lot. Los Angeles Rams might be decent there. But Baltimore should be very tough. Tennessee should be very tough, so I don't like that. Craig Reynolds, Atlanta, don't love the matchup. Green Bay, not terrible. That's as long as we're expecting David Montgomery to be out. But even after that, Carolina, I don't necessarily love or hate the matchup there. I don't feel a whole lot of upside. I do think that he'll get used. I just don't think he'll be highly efficient. And so that's one thing, too, with Jahmyr Gibbs. Expect his role to maybe increase a little bit, but I don't know that it increases a whole lot. Then we have Matt Breida, who will wait and hear on Saquon Barkley. But for now, going up against San Francisco, I'm really not going to trust that. They did draft a running back in the draft this last year. Is he going to be getting the Zach Moss type of workload or not? We don't even know that. But after that, Seattle, Miami, maybe some better matchups if in the long term he's relied upon, depending on, once again, that Saquon Barkley injury. Then we have the potentially more than a stash guys, and honestly, I think out of anybody, Roschon Johnson's the guy who I would suggest having most on your roster. He's not somebody that you're going to be relying upon next week, but I do believe that he will have immense upside at some point this season, and from that point forward, once he, I believe, gets the starting role on this offense. And then Jaylen Warren, I don't think his path to becoming a number 1 running back is quite so easy, but it does look like he's going to have a role. We'll see tonight. More news on that. He could move in any which direction based on what happens tonight. And we have my high-end stashes. Pretty much going to stay the same, except Zach Charbonnet is going to be added into this group compared to last week because he got dropped a fair amount. I don't know what people were expecting when they drafted him, that they just dropped him based off of that. But I still like to have a running back for the Seattle Seahawks, and he's next man up, I do believe, in the event of an injury, so he's worth stashing if he's available in your league. Same with Tank Bigsby, Elijah Mitchell, Jerome Ford, and of course, if things were to change tonight, Jerome Ford's the guy who could move up to the top of this list potentially. So you never know. Jalen Warren, same thing, could move all the way up to the top of the must-roster list. Then we have potential spot starters, Tyjae Spears, and I'm going to hold strong with Clyde Edwards-Helaire here. It was a weird week leading into the game. He was the team didn't know really if they were going to have him or not. They brought up LaMichael Pirine on Saturday just in case. So I just don't think that he was there more so as an emergency. And based on what I saw in week 1, I do think that his usage will be something that will concern Isaiah Pacheco owners and, maybe make him, I guess, a potential starter in case of an emergency. I still think he's that kind of guy right now. And he has some backup potential. Both of these guys have that stash potential in addition to potentially being a starters. Then we have other stash options, Devon A-Chain, Sean Tucker, Kendre Miller. We'll see what happens tonight. He could move into other groups for sure after tonight. Zamir White, Deuce Vaughn, Rico Dowdle. Just, once again, guys that you're going to stash in case of an injury, something like that. Guys that you pick up this Sunday morning when you put someone into your IR spot and you have an extra spot. These are the top names that I would suggest grabbing and not necessarily hoping for, but in case something does happen, they may be the next man up in a good spot. And you could, but I wouldn't, pick up Chuba Hubbard, Rashad Penny, Latavius Murray, Cam Akers. I don't know if there's going to be people telling you to hold on to these guys or to pick them up for one reason or another, but like Cam Akers, you can drop. Rashad Penny, you can drop. Latavius Murray, you should not be picking up in case. I don't think there would be anybody out there recommending that, but just in case, I wanted to get that out there. Then Chuba Hubbard, based on tonight, if he has another week like last week, I would think that you could put him into this potential spot starter group. I was trying to remember where I should put him. That's going to bring us on to the wide receivers, and I'm a little bit confused. Don't know what to think of these Green Bay Packers receivers, Romeo Doubs and Jaden Reed. Romeo Doubs, who I have as a must-start, must-roster, and in part, the only reason he didn't get moved down into the should-roster group is because of these matchups coming up against Detroit and Las Vegas, much like what I liked for the quarterback, Jordan Love, and just like I like that for Jaden Reed. So a couple of really good matchups coming up for these guys soon. Could be valuable guys to maybe get a week early onto your roster here if they're still available. And I think that Romeo Doubs still has more long-term upside just as a bigger play guy than Jaden Reed, somebody who's definitely had the hype behind him here over the past couple of seasons, his first 2 years in the league, and had a big week 1. But it was a little bit concerning in week 2, and he didn't really show up. And whether that's his fault or the quarterback's fault, that I don't really care. It didn't come through, and you would have liked to have seen him build up on week 1 in some way or another, not necessarily getting another 2 touchdowns, but just a little concerning. And Jaden Reed is a guy who I think his role changes the least in this offense once Christian Watson's back, and he could potentially become reliable. I think that he's worth a roster spot. Now, when I say should roster, must roster, that doesn't mean your specific roster. That just means somebody's roster in most 12-team leagues should be able to find a spot, a role for these guys to hold on to for at least in the short term. So to finish up the must rosters, Elijah Moore. We'll see what happens tonight, of course, but I think that he is a must roster regardless. Then Rashid Shaheed. We'll see what happens tonight. See if he might push himself into a must roster spot. I just don't expect him to be super consistent, just like I don't expect Tank Dell to be super consistent. But both of them, really, through their time in the NFL so far, one of them has had a longer period of time in the NFL, and they're, in the instance of Tank Dell and their pedigree coming into the NFL, have a lot of upside to them and could be more and could be somewhat consistent guys if things go right for them. So I do believe that they definitely deserve a spot on your roster. Then Rashee Rice, it's a long call. He didn't have a big week 2 here, but I'm keeping him in this group because I still don't trust those other receivers for Kansas City a whole lot, and I still think that there's going to be a shot for him to come in and be the main guy here down the road. It's not the best strength of season for the schedule for him, and looking in the short term, that'd be nice if you could trust him against Chicago, but it's really hard to trust him. That's a DFS kind of play there. But then in 2 weeks, he's got Minnesota. So if things go well here, especially this week, in 3 weeks, he might be a guy who you could start. So wouldn't mind having him on the backside of my roster. Then Josh Reynolds, just making this should roster list. He's a usable guy. He's a rosterable guy. Not the greatest matchups coming up is what kind of holds me back. And don't know once Jameson Williams comes back what that does to the role for Josh Reynolds and how reliable he'll be from that point forward. So just season long, a little bit more concerned about him. Then for the stream and see guys, these are just going to be your really, really risky but high upside guys. Marvin Mims Jr. I don't think he'll ever be somebody that you want to rely on week in and week out, but I think that that's possible. It was really disappointing to see him not get more work in the second half of the game after having such a successful first half, and then you see the offense struggling throughout the second half, and it's like, what happened to Marvin Mims? So I don't know what they're doing with that. You would like to see something more. Once again, a real good DFS option for next week. Kadarius Toney, I don't know about real good, but could be a DFS guy too going up against Chicago. So a couple of good matchups here for these guys to maybe cement themselves on these teams if they can turn it around, whether it's their fault or not in this case of Marvin Mims necessarily. Then go on to the could roster guys. Tutu Atwell, still don't know about the long-term longevity, but for the short term, going up against Cincinnati next week, could see him have another big week. Just don't know once that team's at full health if he's going to be reliable at all. Then Allen Robinson, we'll see what happens tonight, but the schedule coming up in these next couple of weeks is pretty solid. So we'll see what happens tonight and see if he remains in this group or not. And that brings us to the usable guys. And this is a group of guys who the expectation is that they'll just kind of remain in this cluster of guys who you could pick up in case of an emergency or whatever as a free agent off of your waiver wire 1 week. Maybe use them for 2 weeks, then drop them and not feel bad about it. Those kinds of guys. Obviously, they can graduate or be demoted from this group, but these are the guys who I think will be able to remain here most likely, and they'll just get shuffled around week in and week out, depending on the schedule over the next couple of weeks, and so that's why I have them in this order. This would be kind of the order, not necessarily the order, since I'm looking at 2 weeks that I'll be ranking them for this next upcoming week, but it's definitely going to be weighted towards this first matchup. So Robert Woods going up against Jacksonville could be a nice high upside matchup for a guy with a nice high floor to meet that floor yet again. And on my watch list, guys, I'm just keeping an eye on to see if usage doesn't increase or whatnot. Jalen Hyatt, Josh Downs, Kelvin Austin, Michael. We'll see about Kelvin Austin tonight, how that works out. Michael Wilson, Demario Douglas, all guys who are essentially stream and C's, but with like a little less conviction, a little more concern, or a little less upside to their name for me. And you could roster these guys, but I just wouldn't. KJ Osborne really did not, he had a decent fantasy day, but did not look good if you were able to watch that. Nick Westbrook-Akina, he's almost a watch list guy, but at the same time, the team turned to being more run heavy this week after being really pass heavy in the first week. So I'm a little bit unsure now of that. He only had 3 targets, did get in for a touchdown, but wasn't enough to make me put him on the watch list or anything. So for now, you could, but I just wouldn't suggest it. Nelson Aguilar, same. You could. I wouldn't suggest it. Same with all of these guys who just had weeks this week, but I don't expect that to be anything you can rely on, anything you'll ever have them in your starting lineup and find success with. Which brings us to the tight ends, and just to let you know, the strength of schedule over here is now based on the next 3 weeks, changed up this format a little bit for the tight ends. And these guys are rosterable and or streamable. So like Sam Laporta, I think should be on rosters. Still less than 60% owned, which by the way was the key marker here, 60% owned on ESPN or more means that the guys just weren't on this list. That doesn't mean that if they're on your waiver wire, you shouldn't grab them. And you can always ask questions down in the comments about what I think of somebody, or if I think you should drop somebody for somebody else and whatnot. So Sam Laporta, I think very much should be owned based on his first 2 weeks. Hayden Hurst has a really nice next 3 weeks. We'll see what he does tonight. That could change where I end up having him on this list. But for now, I'm really excited about that. It's supposed to be a good season-long schedule as well. Gerald Everett, another guy with a couple of really nice matchups coming up over the next couple of weeks that could produce some good fantasy outcomes for him. And I do actually like him in the short term more than Jake Ferguson, going up against Arizona, New England, San Francisco. Arizona, yeah, this could be just like week 1 for Dallas, and they could just absolutely rock Arizona, make them look like the New York Giants of week 1. And so that takes away from the upside, whereas a guy like Gerald Everett, that should be a back and forth passing heavy game with a lot of scoring going on. I'll take that touchdown upside for Gerald Everett over Jake Ferguson in that game, for instance. So that's where I have Gerald Everett a little bit higher for now. But I will say long-term, Jake Ferguson is probably the better stash kind of guy. Luke Musgrave, you see a couple of good matchups coming up shortly, so you like that. But once again, I'm still not sold on this passing game from Jordan Love right now. It's ended up looking nice for fantasy points for Jordan Love, but I don't know that it's been really that great so far. There's good and there's bad. There's things to love about it. There's things to not love about it. It's a little bit inconsistent so far. So we'll see if he can't button down the hatches and get better, but it's not a super surprise either. Then Hunter Henry, obviously we've seen the first 2 weeks, but Miami's like the absolute best tight end matchup that there has been for some time now. So that was no surprise. You look at who he's coming up against over the next 3 weeks, and I'm not overly excited about that going against the Jets, Dallas, New Orleans there. Irv Smith Jr., he's just a guy that you can play if you need some upside any given week. Of course, this offense has not looked great so far, but I do expect them to turn that around, and I like this matchup a little bit more than Zach Ertz, who's going to be going up against Dallas, and just talked about how I think that matchup could look. And then San Francisco after that, not really great either, so really high floor guy, but still not sealing the ceiling, at least in the short term. And Logan Thomas, unfortunately, got injured. I think he's a great stash if you have a good tight end and you like to hold on to 2 tight ends, or he'll become a guy that you can use again once he's back. And Chig Okonkwo hasn't been a promising first 2 weeks, but he's a really, really high upside guy that you could always throw in there and hope for the best. At least that's what we believe he is. And on my watch list, I'm a Juwan Johnson hater, so we'll see what he does tonight. He could easily put himself onto this list. Won't take too much for him to get there. And then Kylan Granson, Mike Gesicki, and Cade Otton are all guys that I am just keeping an eye on, but for now, I don't think I would quite feel comfortable picking them up off the waivers and putting them in. So that is it. Thank you very, very much for stopping on through. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Or do one of the 3. It's always appreciated if you made it to this point in the video. Once again, if you have any questions, just ask them down in the comments and I will get to them. This is a list that is up on the website, so that way you can, it's not only for the waiver wires, also for free agents throughout the week, so you can go back and look at it. Or, of course, you can just look at my rankings for that week. But if you're looking for somebody who might have a little bit more long-term value than just this upcoming week, I think that this is a good place to check it out and maybe weigh that against what you're looking at as far as the rankings go for that specific week if you don't necessarily need someone to start. So there you go. Goodbye.